All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our workshop, Understanding Zakat. So today's training is part of our Her Leadership Toolbox series, which is sponsored by Islamic Relief. So thank you to Islamic Relief for generously supporting our programming. So this series of monthly trainings has been designed to support our Women's Action Network, which is a community of practice dedicated to supporting the leadership of Muslim women through the sharing of knowledge and resources. If you're a local Muslim woman leader who is not already a part of our group and who would like to join, you can fill out a form that I'm going to drop in the chat right now, or you can contact me. And my name is Sophia Asidram, and I am the Women's Action Network Coordinator. So before we get into the workshop, I want to go ahead and start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, most merciful, all praise is for Allah, Lord of all worlds, the most compassionate, most merciful, Master of the Day of Judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you are displeased with, or those who are astray. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our director, Sadaf Saeed. Go ahead, Sadaf.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I know most of you. My name is Sadaf Saeed. I'm the executive director of the Muslim Women's Organization. First, I wanted to start off by apologizing in advance. I am in a hotel room in Connecticut for a wedding, and I just couldn't miss this session. It's just been something on my mind, and it's a very important topic. So if I break up and cut in and out, it's because the hotel internet is really awful. But I hope you all really learn a lot from this session. It's something we've been wanting to do since Ramadan, because it's a topic that comes up again and again and again. And as women leaders, as leaders in general, because you're not all women in this room, people that are part of boards of masajid and organizations, it's important for us to understand what zakat really is all about and how it can be used to make an immense difference in our community, and maybe not as limited of a difference as we tend to do. And this is something that I've learned over the past couple of years as part of the philanthropy fellowship in Muslim philanthropy and humanitarian studies at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. I was part of this. I had the honor of being a part of this in 2020, 2021. And one of the classes that I took was with Dr. Shahid Siddiqui. And we spent a few weeks really learning about zakat, sadaqah, Muslim giving. What are the categories? How can it be used? And how it can really be reframed and thought of in a very unique way that we may not even be used to. And it changed the way I looked at zakat. And I thought this is such an important topic to bring back to our community and to share with everyone. And we thought Ramadan would have been the perfect time to do it. So we're grateful that Shara could join us today. And I know some of you registered in Ramadan. I'm just going to hand it over to Sophia again, and I just really appreciate everybody's presence. And if I'm in and out, please know I am listening, and my connection hopefully will stay on throughout. But I really appreciate everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Sadaf. So before we head into the workshop, I'm going to just go over a few community agreements. So I see some of you are joining us from a cell phone. If you are, please feel free to rename yourself with your actual name so we know who you are. If you're able to, turn on your video so we can see you. If not, there's no judgment there. And then just please remain muted throughout the session. Towards the end, Dr. Siddiqui will give us some time to ask questions. But until then, just try to remain muted so that we can minimize distractions. And then after speaking, during our Q&A session, make sure that you leave space for others who may not have been able to speak to ask questions as well. And now I'm going to just go ahead and jump into our speaker bio. So Dr. Siddiqui is an assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He has a PhD and MA in philanthropic studies from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and he also has a JD from the McKinney School of Law at Indiana University and holds a BA in history from the University of Indianapolis. Indianapolis. So Sharik authors research on Muslim philanthropy in the Muslim nonprofit sector. Most recently, he conducted a national survey of full-time Islamic schools in the United States. This project resulted in the book that he co-authored, Islamic Education in the United States and the Evolution of Muslim Nonprofit Institutions, published in November 2017. Sharik also serves as the co-editor of the Journal of Muslim Philanthropy and Civil Society, Journal on Education in Muslim Societies, and as the series editor of the Muslim Philanthropy and Civil Society book series, all three of which are published by Indiana University Press. He has served as a nonprofit practitioner for over 20 years for international, national, regional, and local nonprofit organizations. Previously, Sharik served as the executive director of the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, ARNOVA. ARNOVA is a leading international association that connects scholars, teachers, and practice leaders in research on nonprofit organizations, voluntary action, philanthropy, and civil society. So we are so blessed to have him joining us today as our guest speaker. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sharik. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Sophia. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to first thank Sister Sophia, Sister Sadaf for inviting me to this presentation. I want to apologize to you for how long it took and not being able to do it during Ramadan. As they know, I've been having health issues for the last year and my life has been somewhat upside down, but I'm really glad, alhamdulillah, that we are finally here today. And actually, because sometimes delays brings about barakah, there is research that we analyzed post-Ramadan that I wouldn't have been able to present at that time. So you're going to get data before anybody else in the world. Nobody's seen this data. Some of the data that you'll hear today, nobody else has heard this. So sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings barakah and has his own reasons for why things are delayed. So I want to apologize there, but I did want to thank both Sister Sadaf, Sister Sophia. Sister Sadaf and I go way back. She was in our program and I learned so much from her and with her. So Jazakallah khairan for being part of our journey together. I also want to thank, for a different reason, Islamic Relief USA. The data that I'll present to you on the Muslim American giving and zakat today actually came because they are funding a 5-year study for us to learn about Muslim Americans giving and so on. And it says a lot about Islamic Relief that when they gave this study, they said, we want you to not only do the study and give it to us, we want you to give this knowledge to everybody. Because they felt that if everybody learns from this, all ships rising will sort of make the pool stronger. So I want to thank Islamic Relief for today's event, but also some of the data that you'll see today, inshallah. With that, one last quick thing. I know sometimes when you're in the middle of a presentation, especially a boring guy like me, very wonky, nerdy, it gets tough. And you may have a question that you will forget. So what I would recommend is if you have a question that's burning and coming up, just put it in the chat feature. And so we'll keep an eye. And then later on when we have, I'll try to answer if I pay attention and if something's relevant, I'll answer right away as part of my comments. If not, we'll answer them at the end. But then in the end, we'll do a live conversation and do that. So and I'll try to stay on track. My kids tell me that I tend to go on too often. So I'll try to be much more disciplined in my presentation today. So today I'm going to talk about Muslim American giving broadly, but then focus on zakat. And one of the caveats that I'll make is I'm a philanthropy scholar. I'm a lawyer, right? I'm not an Islamic scholar. So I'm going to be raising some of the questions that Islamic scholars have raised about zakat. And zakat can be somewhat of a controversial conversation topic because there's a number of important different opinions, diversity of opinions. But I'll talk about what those issues are, and I'll try to say, how do American Muslims answer those questions? And so the key thing is, ultimately, you may agree or disagree with some of the decisions American Muslims are making, but, alhamdulillah, we all have that opportunity and right to do so. My recommendation always is study zakat for yourself, reach out to the Islamic scholars that you feel comfortable with their advice, and then make your own decisions about zakat. And so with that, I'm going to launch into this conversation. So I want to start with prefacing that my research largely focuses on American Muslims. And American Muslims, as you know, we're a small population, less than around 1% of the population, 3.45 million Muslims, 42% of whom were born in the United States. And so when we think about Muslims, Muslims define philanthropy more broadly than the general population in the United States. So when you think about, even at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we say voluntary action for public good. People think about time, treasure, talent, money, time, and then your talents that go into the organization. But Muslims go back to the hadith of the Prophet, where the Prophet was asked, peace be upon him, how do we go to heaven? And he said, give charity. And they said, well, how do you give charity? And he said, give money. And they said, well, what if you can't give money? He said, well, go work for someone, help them make money so that they can give charity. So in essence, everybody that works for Microsoft is part of, in that definition, Gates Foundation, even though they don't have a decision making and it's not their personal money, but they've created that wealth they've created that wealth that's resulted in the Gates philanthropy. So, well, what if we can't do that? He said, have good intentions, help your relatives, if you smile, right? And they said, what if we can't do that? They said, well, if you're about to say or do something that you realize causes harm, don't do that. So this is a hadith that many people have probably learned over time. People always, I grew up as a child learning smiling is sadaqah. But what we did was we actually did, with Islamic Relief's help, a nationwide survey using the CNN polling company and also the company that ISP uses for the American Muslim poll. And we said, how do American Muslims define philanthropy? And what we found, American Muslims define philanthropy as being smiling, good intentions, helping individuals, relatives, commanding right, furthering God, causing no harm, and advocating for the oppressed. And I just want to stop here and say one small thing. People say, well, smiling or doing no harm, how can that be helpful to the world, right? And think about this. I'm a big climate change environmentalist activist, and so I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat because of that, right? What's interesting is that most of the things that we do to help the environment is not do stuff. We don't turn on lights, right? We don't use non-compostable materials. There's a lot of things that we don't do, and it's because of us refraining from doing those things that we believe that the environment is going to get better. And so imagine within an Islamic understanding of philanthropy, what an impact we could have when it comes to just the environment alone, not with money, but within the idea of not doing harm, right? And when we think about philanthropy, and we're going to talk a little bit about this debate, Zakat is an important aspect of Muslim philanthropy. At least this is where the one position statement you'll hear me take. I believe that Zakat is philanthropy. And Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, right? And research actually shows that American Muslims, if after Shahada being the first pillar that's most important, Zakat is probably the second most important pillar to most American Muslims. Then fasting, prayer, etc., and Hajj being at the end. But when American Muslims are asked, after Shahada, Zakat is probably the most important pillar. And Zakat is, and we'll talk a little about this, whether it's tax and so on. But one of the interesting things is people get confused when we hear the term sadaqah. And the reality is, the reason why the confusion exists is because in the Quran and in Hadith, Zakat and Sadaqah are used interchangeably. And so most scholars have now come to the conclusion that Sadaqah, Zakat, is a form of Sadaqah. It's the obligatory form of Sadaqah. So there's Sadaqah that is non-obligatory. It can be anything, given to any purpose, any reason, and that's Sadaqah. And then the obligatory purpose of a form of Sadaqah is Zakat. And there are 8 categories that Zakat can go to: the poor, the needy, to those who collect it, and these days it's been redefined to mean administrators, to those who administer it, those who have reconciled to Islam, to free those in bondage, slavery, to those that are debt-ridden for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or fi sabilillah, and to the wayfarer, the traveler. And all of these terms have, depending on school of thought, the scholar you're talking to, the country in the world, even within that school of thought, they have been redefined, right? And so in today's day, for example, at one point, if you did a very strict constructionist argument of just looking at fi sabilillah, right? Fi sabilillah at that time, during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was largely used when they were going towards jihad. There was no standing army at that time. So zakat was used for the purposes of jihad. So there are some scholars that say that this is the only purpose that can only be defined that way. But as you may know, many Muslim American organizations and scholars, and even in UK and others, and speakers like Zakir Naik and others, have said fi sabilillah could be to any Muslim organization, right? Anything that furthers the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there are these kinds of debates. What does it mean for slavery? Does slavery exist in the modern era? If it does, what does that mean, and how can we do that? What does it mean to resolve, like, to help the debt-ridden? Or within my class that Sadaf was part of, they redefined wayfarer to include refugees. So refugees were a form of wayfarer. So these are decisions made in the modern contemporary world, in the United States and over the world, where you on a daily basis are looking at those 8 categories, doing your best, listening to boring people like me and exciting sheikhs out there, and then reading a whole bunch, and then trying to decide how you're going to spend your zakat, right? So one challenge that we face is the challenge of definitions. What do all of these things mean today? And in my class, the one that Sadaf was part of, we actually have an assignment where Zakat Chicago gives us $5,000 that we give away. It's an actual grant competition that students design, and they read about all this stuff, they redefine it, and then they create a grants application that's given out to Indianapolis-based nonprofits. They apply, and then students decide which nonprofit proposal best meets definitions of zakat. And it's a really exciting project. I've learned so much because of those amazing students like Sadaf. So what are some of the questions that we have today, right? And I'm just giving a few. One big question that comes up all the time is, can zakat be given to non-Muslims, right? And there are some scholars that say, no, zakat can only be given to Muslims. And there are some scholars that say, no, it can be broader. And some have redefined it in the middle and said, look, if you're taking a zakat to a region in the world, say Syria, and to Syrian refugees, you're not supposed to go into the camps and say, are you Muslim or are you non-Muslim? You just have to, you know that most of the people in this area are Muslim, so you sort of intervene. So depending on the organization, the individuals, and so on, these terms are defined, but it's one of the big ones that is out there. The second question is, can zakat be given to organizations or individuals? This is largely because there's a hadith of the Prophet in which he said, your responsibility of zakat is fulfilled when the recipient becomes the owner of it. So if you're about to give me zakat, your intention is not enough. It's only when you give the money and the money becomes mine that that obligation is fulfilled. And so then the question is, we're giving it to the organizations. The organizations are the intermediaries, right? So is that fulfilled? And depending on the scholar, you'll have different interpretations of what does that mean, that whole process. It's why right after, in 2001, 2002, I used to work at ISNA. And back then, there were a number, 2 or 3, Holy Land Foundation, a couple of others that were shut down by the government, and their money was sitting there in frozen. And donors were calling the Fiqh Council of North America, they were calling ISNA headquarters and saying, look, we gave our zakat to that organization. Do we have to re-give zakat? Because that money is sitting in this frozen account. Were our obligations fulfilled because of this defined? So it's a real question that you grapple with. Then the question is zakat a tax or charity and philanthropy? If you speak to Professor Amy Singer, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, they argued that zakat is not charity, it's not philanthropy, it's an obligation, and therefore it's a tax. And traditionally, governments collect that. If you listen to Timur Quran, you listen to a bunch of other scholars, they'll tell you, no, tax is something that's in this real world, but many Muslims don't live in the Muslim majority places where governments take. In fact, very few governments actually collect zakat, right? And even in those countries, people disagree. So, in Indonesia, Amelia Fozia did some research about this, where in Pakistan, where the countries where zakat collection actually happens by government, we find that there's even disagreement by people there. But there's a question about this. Is zakat a tax, or is it charity or philanthropy? And then the question is, who should collect zakat? Is it a government? Is it Islamic relief type organizations? Should it be a local Zakat Chicago? Should it be a masjid? Or should we just be taking on the responsibility? And then in addition, should zakat be divided equally among the 8 categories, or is it upon our discretion? So for example, some people have argued that Muslim nonprofits should be allowed to have administrative costs. Because if zakat, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that one of the categories that zakat can go to is the people that are administrators, the staff, right? The staff of that suggests that in that paradigm, overhead admin costs are halal zabiha, right? Because in that case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says zakat can be used for administrative overhead costs of collection and distribution of zakat, which is what most organizations do, right? In the Muslim community. But so that's one position. The other one is that no, it can only be given to individuals. And then the third position, another position has been no more than 12.5%. I asked that question of someone who said that. And I said, how did you come up with this 12.5%? They said, well, there are 8 categories. 100 divided by 8 is 12.5%. But there are no such I couldn't find any of these numbers in the Quran or in the Sunnah. So, but over time, people make decisions, interpret, and decide. And these are some of the questions. And there are many other questions that are out there, right? That we engage with all of the time. Even in every Ramadan, my wife and I sit down, we calculate our zakat, we then jointly decide. Even between my wife and I, we have many disagreements, but there's also a disagreement about zakat. And so what we do is whenever we have a disagreement, we just agree that we will put that organization or that cause in our sadaqah basket. So we figured out after 20 plus years of marriage that sadaqah can be a peace, a way to resolve our discussions about conflict. We don't argue about zakat. We just say, okay, if it's not unanimous, we're just going to put in the sadaqah bucket. And so in the United States, some of the challenges that we faced, one of them is that prior to the United States, to 9/11, and if you go to most studies that I've seen around the world, zakat giving is largely informal. That means that I will give it to a relative of mine or friend. So I won't give it through organizations or through government. I'll just give it to someone I know. But post 9/11, Muslim philanthropy has largely become formal. And that's a whole new debate, and I can answer questions about what it is. But there's research that prior to 9/11, of the many countries that were receiving remittances were Muslim majority countries. After 9/11, that stopped. There are issues of calculation. How do we calculate it? What's that 2.5% look like? And if the 2.5% is actually a very simplistic form. There's actually a very complicated calculation depending on whether you own cattle or whether you own an orchard. Your assets were put in different things. If you own 2 homes, the predominant position is that your own home, the one you live in, you don't have to pay zakat on, but your second home you do. In my case, we have 4 cars. My wife owns one, I have one, and my 2 kids have cars. They all use the cars for work. So we go by that group that says since those cars are not wealth, they're neat because we don't have a public transport system, they're not subject to zakat. Then there's gold, the gold that we keep at home, my wife wears on a daily basis, that's not subject to zakat. But the gold that she wears only on special occasions or sitting in the safety deposit box are subject. So, and people make these decisions. just to give you an idea of how difficult and confusing this is, the UNHCR has a Zakat fund, and they are trying to get as many fatwas to show that that's kosher or halal, sorry. And so far they have 17 fatwas. And even now there are people that say, well, you're missing this point. So it's, even for an organization like the UN that's out there, they're working with Islamic Development Bank, they're working with Al-Azhar, they're working with scholars, these big scholars all over the world. They have 17 fatwas and still they haven't covered all the objections. So Zakat is complicated. And this is especially because where American Muslims are very diverse, right? We're diverse racially, ethnically, but we're also diverse in terms of our opinions about what is, or which fact to follow. And some of the other challenges are, who collects Zakat? Is it Islamic Relief? Is it organizations like Zakat Chicago? Is it like Pillars Fund, the American Muslim? Are they national charities? Should it be mosques and individuals, right? So these are all the challenges that we face. So I'm going to share some studies that help answer the question of how American Muslims try to resolve some of these things. So you already know 1% of the population, Muslims are highly diverse, Arab, Asian, African American, Hispanics, Caucasian, but no one group is a majority, right? So there are prior research by Dr. Hassan Bagby, Zogby's done a lot of work, Georgetown's Al-Walid Center has done some of these research, and Pew has done some really important research. I would argue ISPU is out there at the forefront as being one of the top institutions that does top level research about Muslim Americans. I have to say that I'm on their board, so but I'm on their board because I really believe they do stellar research. So and so there's prior research, and so we're actually not coming in and doing this all from scratch. We're actually building on these amazing studies before, right? So sometimes people come and say, oh, I did this great research. Yeah, in our case, we're building upon the foundation laid by ISPU, by Dr. Hassan Bagby, by all these amazing, incredible scholars that have helped us so on, and we reach out to them all the time. And so one of the things we did was we hired SSRS. They do CNN's polling. They do the American Muslim poll for ISPU. And we did a nationwide study. It's a representative sample of 2005 people. Half were Muslim and half were the general population. And what I'm going to share with you is a representative study. So it's a study that basically the numbers, it's like a polling data for, where we get on CNN, they'll say 50% of the people will vote for so-and-so. It's that kind of thing. And there's always a margin of error. And we looked at all these different questions, and I'm going to go into some of the findings. The first thing I'll tell you is American Muslims last year gave $4.4 billion in philanthropy. That's $4.4 billion that was given. And what's interesting is that nearly half of them, around $2.5 billion was given to Muslim-led nonprofits. Around nearly 2 billion, 1.9 billion was given to organizations of other faiths. For example, ACLU could be one example, Catholic Charities may be another example, American Red Cross, those. So it was, but nearly half was into Muslim-led nonprofits and nearly half went outside. And what's interesting is that American Muslims on average gave more per household, not as total number, compared to the general population by nearly a third. So American Muslims give more. Now, there is some research that if you put this out against Jewish and Christians and so on, we didn't do that. We just looked at Muslims and the general population, and we found out that they gave on average a third more. If you ask people why they gave, American Muslims, number one reason was compassion, concern about less fortunate. They were, if they felt a nonprofit organization or sector was reputable or reliable, they gave to them. Peer pressure was less important, right? So, sometimes you feel you're like your friend giving, so then you'll give because your friend is giving or because you were asked. Those are less important. The top reasons were compassion, concern for others, and the reputation of the nonprofit organization they were giving to. What's interesting is that American Muslims do give a lot to masajid, but Muslims give less to houses of worship than any other faith community in America. So Christians, Jews, other people will give more to houses of worship. Muslims give less. The top three priorities were houses of worship, international relief, and domestic relief. And when I say relief on both international and domestic, it's poverty alleviation. And I'll give you some more numbers to help with this. But what's interesting is 86% of all Muslim American giving stays in the US. Only 14% goes outside the United States, which is really incredible considering a lot of people think that most of Muslim money goes outside to relief organizations and to other countries, but that's not true. And Muslims give more to poverty relief in terms of Muslims prioritize poverty over any other faith community more than, and they civil rights, with the exception of Jews. So Jews and Muslims are very similar in terms of how high poverty and civil rights are in terms of their giving priorities. What's interesting is Muslims, on average, we looked at the COVID, how important was COVID relief, and Muslim Americans are more likely than the general population to give to COVID and COVID relief, to civil rights, right? And what's interesting is, if you think about it, in the general population, most people, when they're up, the people that give the most are usually at the 55 and above. But in the Muslim American community, if you think about it, the most generous are between 40 and 49, and then it's 30 to 39, right? So when we are thinking about who we should be thinking about asking for money, we usually always think about the uncles and aunties that are older, doctors, businessmen that are older. We may be overlooking a really important dynamic, which is this 30 to 39 and 40 to 49, right? So there are young people that are giving, we're just not prioritizing them. This research we're looking into a little bit more. One of the concerns that there's a big difference in gender, and we're trying to figure out why that is, why this shows up this way, whether women are giving less than men comparatively because of opportunity, because of structural differences, or research. I'll give you one example from the last two Eids. I was just looking at this data, and there was my son actually was moving the box around the musalla, and at some point it just hit me. I just seen this data. I texted my wife, and I shouldn't do that, but in the middle of Eid prayer, during the khutbah, I sent my wife a text and I said, is there someone upstairs in the women's area doing the box? And immediately my wife and daughter responded. They said, in the 20 years we've been going to Eid here, there's never been a box in the women's area during Eid. So are we not providing, institutional structures help people give, right? And if we're not making those, it's harder for people to give, right? So are we creating the structures necessary? And then there's other research that shows that women are more likely, and we're about to produce a report in August, which will show that people will be more likely to give, and especially women, if they see tolerance and diversity, equity, inclusion in the organization. So are boards the kinds of organizations that will inspire giving, especially for women? The more educated you are, the more likely you're to give, right? I'm just going to quickly go into some of this. Relief giving is around 24%, but what's interesting is that only 14% goes overseas. 86% stays in the United States. So if you're an organization that focuses on domestic poverty relief, you are amongst the top priorities for Muslim donors. And then we found the same data. Muslims are more likely than the general population to give proportionately in terms of the time for causes. So how do men and women differ in their beliefs about how zakat should or shouldn't be given, right? And this is a second study. Basically, I'll give you a quick rundown on this. What we did was we did a study right after COVID happened during Ramadan. So that first Ramadan during COVID. So it was really interesting. And we created a control group, and then we created 3 different, and it's a psychosocial test. We did social norms theory. So we would give these tests, and then people would read them, and based on that, they would answer. And then we had ways to test it. So this is a psychosocial sort of experiment that we did in that period of time. And we looked at about people's views about zakat. And because COVID was just starting, we decided to put COVID questions in here. But in essence, we were wanting to figure out whether men and women differed in their in the way they thought about and gave zakat. And we found that that was, and I won't go into all this, but I'll just share with you that they did. Sorry, here we go. This is just a regression table and so on. But what we found is that women are more likely than men to believe that zakat can be given to non-Muslims, right? So I told you that was a question. So if you are a non-Muslim cause, you're more likely to have success with women rather than men over whether zakat should be given to non-Muslims. Muslim women are more likely than Muslim men to donate zakat causes that don't primarily benefit Muslims, right? Muslim women more likely than men would included COVID relief as being part of zakat, right? So this question of, can we give our zakat money to COVID related causes? And women interpreted that was the case. Muslim women are more likely than men to donate funds, non-zakat funds, to COVID relief. So in essence, what we found is that gender has a direct connection on how there are gender differences. And in essence, what this all is saying is that women have a broader and more inclusive definition for zakat than men do. So, you know, I talked about those 8 categories and how do we define. More likely than not, women would have a much more inclusive definition to all those questions, right? Now, are there outliers? Yes, but this is what we found in this experiment, right? So then we looked at, okay, so we know there's a difference between men and women. Is there a difference between older and younger amongst the generational differences, right? And again, we asked the same kinds of questions, same kinds of regression tables. And what we found is that the majority of Muslim Americans believe that charitable contributions are monitored by law enforcement, so they feel that they are scrutinized. But younger Muslim Americans are more likely to donate to Muslim causes compared to older Muslims. So far too often, we're just thinking about the older generation when it comes to Muslim nonprofits. But in reality, and there's a couple of other studies that have sort of has furthered this. The ISPU's Philanthropy report is another example, where we are finding that younger people are more committed to Muslim nonprofit organizations compared to older people. And so it's an interesting finding. Older Muslim Americans are more likely to send charity abroad compared to younger. So if you're a domestic nonprofit organization, a younger person is more likely to be supportive of you. And then younger Muslim Americans are more likely to donate causes primarily benefiting Muslim Americans compared to older. So these were some of the things. And so we found that there was generational differences, right? And again, adding to the complexity of how diverse Muslim Americans already are. Sorry. And here we go. So then this report just came out in Ramadan. And it's basically the Muslim American Zakat report. And what we found is that Muslims gave out of I remember I told you about the $4.3 billion. So an estimate of that, around $1.8 billion was zakat. So last year in 2021, even though the study said 2022, because that's when it came out, in 2021, Muslim Americans gave $1.8 billion to zakat. Now, what's interesting, unlike the broader giving of American Muslims, 25% versus 14% of zakat went overseas. 18% went to domestic poverty relief. Remittances also went overseas. So this is like if I were to send money to my grandmother. So 25 went to organizations like Islamic Relief, Zakat Foundation of America, and so on. 12.7 went to my relatives overseas. And then this big chunk, the white colored one, I'll give you the exact number, but around 20% of it were given to government. Now, we don't know whether this is someone saying, I believe zakat is a tax, and therefore when I paid my income tax, I don't have to pay zakat, because there are people that are donors of mine that believe that. They say, Shariq, this is sadaqah, I don't pay zakat because I pay 50% or 40% taxation, and that tax is supposed to cover all these things. So there are Muslims. We don't know if this is that, or this is people that have, for example, in Pakistan, if my parents have a bank account in Pakistan, my in-laws have it, and every year during Ramadan, at one period of time, the government takes zakat money automatically from those savings accounts. So we don't know if it's that, but it's interesting for us that the government category came out, and I don't know enough about what that is, and so next year we'll be asking some more questions to go into that. But what I thought was interesting is zakat is more likely to be global and informal. If you think about it, remittances and informal philanthropy, where I just help someone out, combined comes to nearly 27, 28%, right? So if you take that 28%, you add the 25 for international nonprofits, nearly half is either going overseas or is being distributed informally. So zakat for domestic US nonprofits may be less of a place to sort of spend, to sort of focus on. But it's an interesting dynamic how this is so different than the global picture on Muslim American giving. We asked Muslims, do you think zakat is tax? Do you think it's philanthropy? Or do you think it's charity? And what we found is that most people thought it was charity. Many people thought it was philanthropy. Very few people, smallest number, felt it was tax. And so the big question here is that the research question that I have for next year is when people say, what's the difference between those people that focus on charity versus philanthropy? Is it possible that there are some people that believe that charity is not part of philanthropy? That's the scientific, there's a whole, and some of know this, I go onto a soapbox because the scientific philanthropy movement thinks of charity as not being philanthropy. And that's a whole new conversation. I have articles about this and so on where I disagree with that, but there's that. And so we're trying to figure out whether Muslims are bought into scientific philanthropy movements, definitions of philanthropy, so on. So we don't know enough, but we thought it was interesting that very small group of people actually believe that it's a tax. Majority of the people believe it's charity or philanthropy. When it comes to by age, again, we found that people between that 40 to 49 year bracket give zakat the most, but then the second highest is 18 to 29-year-olds. So in zakat, there's some really interesting dynamics here where younger people, again, and American Muslims, by the way, skew younger than the general population anyway. This is data about race. The Caucasian number looks really high. But what I would tell you is that Caucasian is not defined in, and we're arguing against so, you know, if you happen to be from Iran, for example, or if you're from Syria, you will be defined as Caucasian within the census, right? So there's a whole bunch of census numbers that that makes this difficult. But so that when we think about that, there's some challenges with this data, but it's data, so I pointed it out there. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop. And I wanted to just spend time on asking questions. And then one thing I wanted to share is that if you want any of these reports, if you go to the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative, both of these reports, the American Muslim Giving Report and the Zakat report, are available. You can download them, all the data is there. And we're going to have our tolerance report or pluralism report that'll talk about some other giving differences coming up in August. In October, we'll be presenting the new giving report so we're doing this for 5 years. So every year we'll have some giving data. And so we're going to be producing 3 to 4 reports a year. So those reports are available publicly. There's no cost to it. You just download them from the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative website. So, okay, so I'm going to stop here. so I took around 45 minutes for the presentation. So I think we have around, Sister Sophia, around what, 45 minutes for Q&A, is that right?
Yeah, so we'll go until 4:30, inshallah. So as many questions as people have. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize if I went too fast. I just like to put more time in the Q&A just because I think that's where the real conversations are. And my children tell me I'm really, really boring.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Okay. Walaikum salam. My name is Khadija. I have a question. You went through the slides, but each topic, I had a question on each one actually, but it's, I guess it's slide number 2.
Mhm.
It's who is eligible for Zakat.
Mhm.
So I know that's a very tricky, challenging question because if it's a woman, there's so many things. If you're married, you're single, you're divorced, widowed, you, in our culture tradition, you own some kind of piece of gold, whether you wear it every day or you don't. So of course there's a difference. Fatwas, like you said, 17 fatwas out there. I've heard one where if you use your jewelry or wear it once a year, you don't have to pay zakat on that. So if that's I'm running with that fatwa. Second is that if you are you have a mortgage and a family member wants to help you pay it off, is that zakatable? Because it becomes an asset. And I heard what you said about our car, that because it's a daily thing. So, and then you own some jewelry and you do have a somewhat comfortable life. Would that be zakatable, or is it lillah, or is it sadaqah? Because of course, if it's zakat, then it's a tax. Yeah, so that's my question.
Yep. So a couple of great questions there. On the first one, there are scholars that argue that when you are giving money to someone to relieve them of their budget, of their debt, which is mortgage, that would count as zakat. Now, there are some people that say it only counts if, for example, if my parents gave me money to pay off my mortgage for my 6,000 square foot 2-acre home, right? So there are some people say, wait a second, no, it doesn't, sharik isn't necessarily. So there are those debates, but there's that piece. Who are you getting it? Are they eligible? So there's a debate there, but there are those people that believe that pure debt release is. Now, let's say my zakat, my home is paid off, right? The majority opinion, very few that I've heard say that I have to pay zakat on it, as long as I live my home, regardless it's $1 billion home or it's a $1,000 home. It's because it's mine in use. It's not one that's subject to zakat
because it's in use.
It's in use. That's
so
right.
it equivalent to the car because it's in use for a certain a certain task like work, school. Okay.
So I'll give you another example, which is kind of recently I just got approached by someone, and I just talked these things through over, and they said, you study philanthropy. So I have a house that I'm living in, and I've just built another house. It's empty. My plan is to move from this house to that house. I'm downsizing because I'm retired, but I've got the house on the market, but it's not selling. So do I have to pay zakat on one, right? And so we had these conversations, and this person said, even though they're both for the purpose of the usage, until that point, one is an asset. So in this person's case, they, based on their advice from their sheikh and so on, decide to pay zakat on the one that was not in use. But the intention was not to own as an asset. So there are these, but when they were when they were asking for, because ultimately this is about intentionality, right? So when they were asking, there were people saying, well, it's an asset, but it's not really an asset that you intend to be an asset. You're just buying it, you're doing it, so you don't have to. But in their case, they went with a much more conservative view. On the jewelry, my wife and I had the same understanding about the jewelry based on lots of conversations we have about our jewelry. But what we did decide is that just because we know this, the jewelry in the safety deposit box you know, we know that it's largely there. You know, it's very rare that we use it and so on. So we basically, so what we did was we basically used all that jewelry. It came in. It doesn't matter whether she used. I didn't ask for each one. Do you use this once a year or not? Even though we agree with that point, we just said it's easier for us to just weigh it all. And there was a whole question, and then we just weighed it, and then we came up with the gold prices for that day, and then that was the valuation for it. And we do that once a year.
Well, you know, you have to be logical, sensible, because it's between you and Allah. So yeah, I think in that when you put logic into it is good. I think the next question has something to do with Nabil's question as well. I'm not sure. If you relieve someone of their student loans, a student, is that zakatable?
So there are a couple of scholars that I've spoken to that have argued that relieving someone of their student loan, right? And for example, there is a great organization out of Texas that does exactly this, right? And the scholars, I forget what it's called, a continuous charity, ACC, a continuous charity. If you go onto their website, they actually focus on a lot of the questions around that. And their argument is that, yes, by helping someone be relieved of their debt, it is a form of zakat. Now, they do it by providing a sadaqah jariyah loan and something like that. So, but again, to other scholars, it's about who are you providing the relieving that debt. For example, I'm an attorney and I have a huge student loan. I'm waiting for my last 3 years of my public loan forgiveness program. I'm hoping it lasts that long. So I have this debt. So am I eligible? You know, I live in a 6,000 square foot home. I live in a 2-acre home. My kids go to private universities and colleges, right? So there are people that say, no, you have to look at who the person is and how, or what you're doing. Now, so, and then the abundance catch-all that people always make out is that you can, if you want to help someone, you can help them out with sadaqah, right? That you can still, wherever you are unsure, just go the sadaqah route. And so, for example, in my wife and my case, what we do is whatever our firm calculations come up to, we just round up. But then zakat giving is probably only a proportion of our giving. We have a lot of sadaqah giving as well, right? So we just always, when we do it, then my wife and I always make the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we've done this with the best of niyyah, you know what's in our heart, but we're going to give more. And if we're short, can you make it up from our sadaqah? And then, so you just hope that, so that's my approach that my wife and I take. But, you know, again, there are scholars that say, no, you will be held accountable, and they may be right. Does that help answer, Sister Khadija?
Yeah, I was actually asking that because if you want to relieve a family member of a debt, aka I'm just using a house, the Sinka's car is a little bit minute. So, but he owns you know, some jewelry or some live a comfortable lifestyle, and of course, you know, it's not a 6,000 square feet home. So would that be considered because it is relieving of a debt? That's you know, because a mortgage is somewhat 30 years old, 30-year long, and it just seems like a never-ending you know, loan that goes away. So that was one of my questions. The jewelry was one, and yeah, one question, I know Nabil has a question too, but one question is, my children, being American born, seems to have a hard time dealing with zakat only to Muslims. Why do we discriminate? And because there's a homeless man that needs it more. So, and I said, yes, give it as a sadaqah, but when you're doing zakat, it needs to be a Muslim, because we start from home, then we do the community, then we do family, and you go to masjid, and then you go out. So I was trying to this thing. How do you explain to someone, you know, and I did it to my best of ability, that, you know, you start from, you know, charity starts from home. That's where the cliche comes in, and you work your way out. Give sadaqah, give lillah, give whatever you want, but zakat comes from this. How do you explain to a American born Muslim teenager that this is where, you know, without sounding like we are so biased and so, you know, discriminatory?
So I start out with sharing with them that in fact, there's no direct evidence, like in the Quran or the Sunnah, it never says that any of these categories are for Muslims. So the first thing I tell them is that they could be right, that this is a good debate to have. There are people in our community that believe that it can only be given to Muslims, and there are others that believe that it should be given to anybody, right? And there's nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah that prohibits the giving of zakat to non-Muslims. And in fact, there are sheikhs out there that point that out and say that there's no such thing. The reason why over time it has largely been limited is because in the beginning, during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, if you think about it, you had initially the people that were the poorest were the Muhajir, right? When they moved to Mecca to Medina. So the most of the eligible people tended to be Muslim. And then eventually it was a majority. Initially Muslims were a minority, but then eventually they were a majority, and then it became an absolute majority, right? Everybody in the Hijaz were Muslim. So the only reason why scholars have argued that it's only given to Muslims is because there was a practice. And the question is, was it a practice by design to limit, or was it practiced by chance by virtue of the way the situation was? And so that's a debate. So what I tell young people, or not even young people, these are even older people have these debates, is I tell them, think about these concepts, make a decision, then ultimately, and this is where I'm talking less as a scholar, but more as a Muslim, is you just make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that whatever decision you're making is the right one. So, but it may be that because during the time of the Prophet, and then he passed away, right, at some point. So the only time when we think about the Quran and the Sunnah as the sources, it came at a very limited period of time in a very limited context. And if we're going to be strict constructionists of that time, and then it should be only Muslims. But it's possible that it's broader than that. So that's the argument that I would make. But I would say is that in the United States, more and more people are defining zakat to be non-Muslims to be eligible to. And what we're finding is they just don't talk about it publicly in the masjid because it's very controversial. But when they give, and when they're talking about it in private surveys, they're saying, yeah, we believe that it should be given to both. And so there's this debate. I'm going to quickly run to Nabil's, and then I'll come back to Sister Khadija as well. The first thing that Nabil asked, and then I'll open it up to some more, but Nabil asked, can helping the needy with financial literacy be considered appropriate zakat distribution? Is zakat, for example, is zakat, that is a zakat, a handout versus a hand up? So Nabil, you asked a really important question, right? The first thing is that there is a zakat amongst most scholars that I have talked to and read believe that zakat in essence is a hand up. And they give us an example for this, and I haven't found the hadith yet, but if anybody has it, please send it to me. Or not hadith, but a time in history. When Hazrat Umar was Khalifa, the zakat collectors were finding people to be zakat eligible that they would give to zakat to, and they couldn't find anyone. And then this is a story, I haven't been able to find it. So if anybody finds this, I'd love to, because I want to dive deeper into this. Like what scholars say is, look, if zakat works out well, the economic situation of that society, inequities go away, and then nobody will be eligible for zakat, right? So it's an Islamic finance system that we're trying to do it. And so in that perspective, it's a hand up versus hand out. But the way most scholars define it today, especially, and when I say conservative versus liberal, I'm not making judgment about pious versus non-pious. Conservative means those that stick to existing practices or ideas, interpretations, and liberal being that one isn't right or wrong. You can have liberal pious people, right? You can have liberal, even narrower definitions. So it's just, but the prevailing view is that it's the way it should be given out is a handout. So, and this issue of can zakat be used for broader purposes, which Nabil is central to your question, the scholar would in the United States, more and more and more, we're getting to that position where scholars are saying that organizations that are doing things to further the cause of Islam in America, Islam in general, would fit within that broad. Now, there are others, and there's a big debate, I won't go into in amongst bloggers that is going on right now, where they're saying we're very conservative. So there's divided opinion. But the fi sabilillah piece is a catch-all. Then in Nabil, your second question, and if I didn't ask it, you can open up on the mic or you can ask more questions, but I'll quickly go to your next ones. Can you elaborate more on the 8 categories of recipients in modern American context, for example, debt-ridden and so on? What advice would you have to masjids? Zakat Chicago is an organization you should reach out to. They've been grappling with this. They give out over $1 million as grants to organizations. They've grappled with this. And then in Malaysia and Indonesia, they've done probably, Dr. Sami Hassan, who's a professor in Australia, has done a lot of work in Malaysia and Indonesia in redefining. By and large, when it comes to these 8 categories, this is where the fi sabilillah is a catch-all for everything, with the exception of masjid building. So masjid building is considered to be not part of fi sabilillah, but pretty much everything else. So many organizations are out there, and with the support of scholars, saying that if you give to a Muslim American organization or a Muslim organization, that's fi sabilillah. There are those that argue that's not the case. It's an ongoing debate, but it's there. The poor, the needy is pretty straightforward. To those who collect, it's largely, if you're a nonprofit organization, you have overhead admin costs, you're able to apply for that. And that's a way a lot of people argue. There are people that argue the opposite, and these debates are ongoing. Those who have reconciled to Islam, this has now been it used to include only people that were converts or reverts, but has been now broadened to include those whose heart may be reconciled. And it used to be like, oh, someone's thinking about becoming a Muslim, so it's that person is right there and making the decision, we can identify it, they become zakat. And now it has been broadened further to say, look, da'wah in general is opening up to people that are whose hearts may be reconciled. So it depends on where you stand on these, but all these views are available there. To free those in bondage is largely credit relief. So people that have credit card debt, that are going into bankruptcy. I have seen people, I used to be a bankruptcy attorney. I used to help poor people with bankruptcy. I would have people come in and pay for my legal retainer to help people through bankruptcy. And we had a legal clinic that we formed and that was helping people with bankruptcy. And I didn't ask them, we didn't say we were zakat eligible, but donors later on told me that the money we gave to you was for zakat, was zakat money, because you were providing a service to get people out of bankruptcy, sort of helping people write off all their debt. Bondage today has been redefined. Sadaf's class redefined that to include human trafficking, but I have other students that have redefined bondage to include people that are, so not just human trafficking, not just pure slavery, but also economic bondage. So, so those kinds of things. Debt-ridden is straightforward. The cause of Allah, fi sabilillah, is very broad. And then travelers has been redefined largely to include refugees. The key thing that I would say, Nabil, to your mosque committee is the following. Have a zakat policy. And the way I would do it is, if you're in a masjid setting, right, bring someone here, talk about that, have a conversation, do shura, then adopt a policy and say, this is it. And say, look, we could be right, we could be wrong, but this is what we've come with the best of our wisdom, the zakat policy of this masjid. And so it's very transparent, right? And then other questions I'll go into, can I reinvest my zakat every year for a bigger project down the road? The argument is, most people that I've talked to have argued that zakat has to be given to an organization during this. So if I have to give zakat, I have to give it within the year. So you have to decide whether it's a calendar year. My wife and I use the Islamic calendar, and we specifically use Ramadan. So we decide before the end of each Ramadan, before Eid al-Fitr every year, That's the predominant view. There are those people that believe that zakat needs to be opened up so it can do the kinds of things that Zakaria, you're talking about. I haven't seen enough scholarship yet to support that. I think we are going in that direction. And I'll give you one small example of this. I won't share you the name, but there's this philanthropist that someone came to, and they were asked, can you help build this masjid, expand this masjid from this small size to this huge masjid? So this person took their money and gave it to build a masjid, with the agreement that a third of all zakat collected in that masjid would go distributed through a certain nonprofit in that community. So they built a waqf. That expansion became a waqf. Controversial decision. Certain scholars believe it's okay, but predominantly I haven't heard that that's the case. But I think we're headed in that direction. Probably 10, 20 years from now, there'll be more scholars along that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just giving you where I see the trends in terms of opinions in the Muslim community. And then Sadaf, domestic violence victims, yes, they have been many domestic violence activists in the United States have defined DV as being zakat eligible. I used to run something called, I used to be, one of my jobs that wasn't on my bio, but I was the director of legal services for the largest domestic violence agency in Indiana. It's one of 2 family justice centers in the United States. And when I was there, because I had so many Muslim women coming to me for help, I actually created a Muslim DV fund. So it was a Muslim American fund and so on. And a lot of the money that we got was from zakat money. And people would tell us that the reason is because they felt domestic violence was a form of bondage, right? And so I think I've been hearing more. I think the catch-all for everyone to make it easier is they go fi sabilillah. It reduces the debate. But to your point, Sister Salat, that's for sure. I've seen that. And I'm not endorsing one or the other. I'm just giving you what I have seen in terms of diversity. The great thing I'll tell you, and this is what I tell a lot of people, I'm a big impressionist, Rembrandt, paintings, Monet. My wife and I love Monet. It's impressionist paintings. And the reason is, when I look at impressionist paintings, I'm reminded of American Muslims. Each dot is different, right? But those dots come together to produce, these different dots come together and produce this beautiful canvas, right? If you go very close to that, to that painting, you'll see very disparate. But if you go look at them from afar, it's beautiful. And so what I think is beautiful about the American Muslim community is we are so different, but collectively we become such a beautiful kind of organism and acting in terms of our faith and philanthropy and so on. So I'm a big Rembrandt person, and I think that, not Rembrandt, a Monet person, and I think Muslim Americans are an impressionist broad canvas, right? So that's why it's different. Okay. Sophia, you asked, is there evidence from a hierarchy in the 8 categories? For example, have scholars discussed the intention behind the categories? Is there evidence in ways in which giving should prioritize and so on? There hasn't been. I think that they believe that the first ones, the poor, the needy, orphans, those are always going to be higher than the ones towards the end. But there is no discourse that I found, and Salah took this class with me, so we pulled in hadiths and we pulled in, I couldn't find any traditional discourse that says this is the prioritization. The sense I get, though, is that most traditional scholars don't like the fi sabilillah going to end the zakat collection, because and I think that is less to do with jurisprudential jurisprudence than just the idea that saying, why should we pay for these organizations? Because even at that point, Islamic scholars are also becoming the impact people. They're thinking, oh, that's not going to have as big of an impact, right? But I haven't found any scholarship. I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to be. Please share any scholarship that you find that contradicts any of these things I'm saying that I haven't found, because it'll help my learning, as it were. Okay, I'm going to rush through these, and then I'm going to open it up because I'm down to the last 2 questions on there. But then that doesn't mean the conversation stops. Should we judge recipients based on how they have used their money in the past? Zakat, for example, someone can't afford food, instead buying an expensive iPhone or shoes. As Zakat distributors, do we help those who have shown in our limited assessment responsible use? It's a good question. And this is what I will say, both from a scholarship point of view, but also as someone who's been a lifelong person that's worked in, most of my career was working with poor people. I helped poor people whose children were taken away by the state. I would fight to get them back. I would help domestic violence victims that were poor. So I've spent a lot of my time, food security. So the three things that I'd say is, I think there's nothing in Islamic literature that says that you have to choose a recipient based on their decisions. We're not allowed to make that judgment, right? And I could be wrong. So ultimately, your responsibility is to find the person that needs, and then it's up to them to spend it. And I'll give you a hadith that maybe and I'm not a sheikh, so please, I don't give Jummah khutbahs, so on. I'm just giving you there's a hadith in which a man comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and says, how do I go to heaven? And he says, give charity. So he gives charity the first day to a man who's in tattered clothes. And the next day he finds out this guy is really rich, just happens to be a miser, doesn't spend money on clothing. So this guy is in despair. So he gives the money again. This time he finds out that the man is actually a thief. He's a robber. So and then in despair, he says, clearly men are not a good bet for my charity. So let me give it to a woman instead. Women may be a better investment. But that woman it turns out, is a prostitute, right? In despair, this guy goes, subhanAllah, I cannot get this thing right. So he goes to the Prophet in despair saying, I tried to do it, but I gave it to these three people. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that you fulfilled your responsibility. God is going to judge you based on your intention. But the outcome is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, right? Whether the miser becomes the generous, whether the robber stops thieving, and the woman stops selling their body is up to them and to God's outcome and barakah to your philanthropy, right? So this is probably the best direct example to your question, Nabil. That's one. So that's the Islamic point. The other piece of it is, I get this refrain all the time. Hey, we gave them money and they bought Nike shoes, right? So-and-so has a better iPhone. Like I don't have a watch, right? But iPhone watch and so on. What I would say is, the cycle of poverty is a really difficult one. And so don't allow what may be a perceived, but the perception of how they're making bad decisions stop you from helping them out. Because even if it's possible, there's this long story. I became Muslim, and Sadaf knows this, I won't go into this, but I became a Muslim when I was 26 or 27, right? And so in that journey, as I was trying to discover faith, there's this really important book, the 7-8 books leading to the death of Socrates by Aristotle, in which he describes what is faith and how do you perceive faith. And he says, faith is like your chariot and you are drowning in water. And every now and then you'll struggle, and you'll put a brief glimpse outside and you'll see the truth, and then you'll be brought in. But that brief glimpse is all you have of God's manifestation, right? And that was really powerful to me amongst, and I won't go into my faith story, but that resulted in helping me understand that God's beneficence is fleeting and occasional, but we struggle to find it. Poverty is the same way. So when you're drowning in poverty, right, God, the beneficence of non-poverty is very fleeting and it's a struggle. So sometimes people have resources and they'll use it for instant gratifications in a way that, we'll look at them and say, hey, wait a second, you could use this to invest this, or you could have done that. But the point is, whatever it is, we have to continue to support them because we have to help them struggle so that those glimpses of non-poverty become less fleeting, so that they can. And there's this whole research on poverty alleviation that I won't go into, but but what I would argue is, don't let that. Now, if there's someone out there that's, totally out of the realms of what is right or wrong. One example is someone needed help, but I knew that they were an alcoholic or they were doing drugs, right? I wouldn't give them charity, because for me, that was not responsible, right? I couldn't, that's not. But if someone was out there that was using my money to buy, say, an iPhone, it's okay. And another piece of it is that, especially when you go to countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, I spent a lot of time in Africa, you'll see all these people having cell phones, right? And some of these are smartphones, not iPhones, but smartphones, right? And people say, hey, we just give them money, and but in those countries, the phone is not a necessity, is a necessity. It's not a luxury, because because of corruption and all that kind of stuff, it becomes the whole form of banking system and so on. Anyway, I'm going into a whole new, I used to teach in development. And so anyway, I'm going to stop there. But you have to ultimately, what I would argue is, find, as Zakat distributors, what you think is the best use of that money. And if it happens to be a person with an iPhone or iWatch or wearing Adidas and Nikes, that's okay. And you never know who gave it to them, right? Because someone gave me, I have an iPhone watch somewhere in my house. I didn't buy it. It was a gift, right? So I don't like wearing watches. It just feels like one more thing I'm responsible for, and I'm not a very responsible person. Okay, next question. Can you touch briefly on Zakat al-Fitr and where and how you should be distributed compared to Zakat al-Mal? Excellent question. Zakat al-Fitr is traditionally given before you start doing Eid al-Fitr prayers at the end of Ramadan. And it is calculated and based on how much it costs to feed a person for a day. And even in Indianapolis, I was surprised, there's like 3 different calculations. I just went with the highest amount. One group said it was 8, one was saying it's 10, one said it was 15 or 20, and I went with the 15 or 20. I forget what the amount was. I think it was 15, because it's inflationary. Like, we know how expensive it is. So, and it is supposed to be distributed before you start praying. And the traditional and predominant opinion is that Zakat al-Fitr is to be used to help people that are needy that cannot celebrate Eid al-Fitr themselves. So, you give it to the mosque, and then the mosque then distributes it to other people that are needy. And it's really connected. It's a very time-bound kind of thing. There are communities, suburban communities, wealthy communities that say, we're supposed to give Zakat al-Fitr, we're supposed to give it to the local. We live in the richest neighborhood in America. There aren't those people. So how do we do it? And so I have started seeing very recently, over the last 5 to 8 years, a few, not predominant, a few examples of Zakat al-Fitr being used towards broader, the idea being, let's invest it in a project so that fewer people in this community will be part of the Zakat al-Fitr recipient. And so there's this development. One point where I remember one conversation I had with one mosque, unnamed, where there was so much debate in their board about Zakat al-Fitr, they did not spend Zakat al-Fitr for 7 years. And the result was that they had nearly $1 million of Zakat al-Fitr collected. And the question was, what do we do with this amount of money, right? And anyway, so it's, and I, I wasn't the person they spoke to. They talked to my boss then. My boss said, do istikhara and give it away quickly. And actually what they did was they actually used that money to endow a local food pantry that made sure that every Eid al-Fitr people that were poor were fed. So right, wrong, Allah knows, but they did their istikhara, and I thought it was a beautiful model and a beautiful solution. Okay, so I will stop here with the questions that I have seen, and then I know we are at 9 minutes to go, so I'll answer any questions that come up. One thing I will share, and then please ask questions, unmic yourself or unmute yourself and ask, or you can put them in the chat, is this. We spend a lot of time in our community debating Zakat. And what I found is that to the point where the debates have become personal and attacking in nature, right? But the reality is that arguably what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly meant by this is only known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The rest of us are just trying to muddle through our day, trying to figure out and discern God's intent, right? So I think, I have never seen a time during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he ever said that he could discern someone else's intent. It's only when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, destroy Masjid Jarar, for example. Like the Prophet knew who were the people that had built Jarar and why, but he didn't make that decision. The only times the Prophet made a decision based on other people's perceived intentionality was when he got a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So my argument always is that if the Prophet, peace be upon him, would never called in question the intents of others, right? Who are we to do so? So that's the only piece. These are very complicated issues, and I just assume that anybody who is Muslim around me or even non-Muslim has good intent, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they're wrong and if their intent is bad, that's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ourselves can make the following arguments, right? Around what I think we should be having conversations is, hey, not that you gave zakat, but once you gave zakat, what was the impact of that? Let's have those conversations, right? Are we doing, even if within my paradigm of what is right for zakat and what is wrong for zakat, did we make the best decision within that worldview, right? Because that's something that if I believe that zakat can be given to Muslim and non-Muslim, for example, then was I smart about it? Did I give it in the right way? Did I find the right people? Did it impact their lives in the way that I hoped it would? Did I stop? Did I give them the money and then I forgot about them? There's this really cool project here in Indianapolis. It's called Imani Aid. In Imani Aid, they go in and they don't just give zakat to the people that are asking. They actually go to their homes. They sit down with them. They talk to them and they say, here's your zakat money that you asked for. And then after conversation, they find out the reason why they have these issues is one's driver's license was suspended. They don't have money to pay for the fine, or another person doesn't speak English. So they then go out and find sadaqah and volunteer resources to actually help them, drive them to some people just need a ride to fill out it's the unemployment application. So they do this kind of thing. And what you find is if you go to Imani Aid's fundraisers today, it's a small organization, a couple of $100,000. Many of the people that they have helped are now part of the Imani Aid volunteer group, right? So zakat, once you give it, there's no requirement that our obligation, that we have to continue. But if we truly believe that zakat is about bringing barakah, is about ending inequality and so on, what are the steps that we're doing to do that? So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I go on there all the time. If my kids were here, they'd be rolling their eyes. And then okay, and then one more question. Yep. So Nabil just wasn't asking the question. He said the point that I was making. So I think he and I are in agreement there. But just want to we have 5 minutes. You feel free to ask questions. I know there's Sadaf has her hand up, so I'll give it back to Sadaf. But I love these conversations.
My question is, we have specific programs in our organization that are eligible programs, right? So we have, and there have traditionally always been food, hunger relief kind of programs. Can you only give zakat to people who request zakat? Or can you just decide that this program is in one of those 8 categories and I will fund it using zakat funds, whether those people understand they're receiving zakat or not, right? Because I know there's a bit of stigma around accepting zakat. So they'll come to us saying that they need help, but when they find out this is zakat money, they'll be like, no. So what are the rulings that you've seen that are pertaining to that? Like, do they have to request it for you to distribute it as zakat? Absolutely.
Not only is there no requirement that they accept it, during the time of Prophet, not Prophet, but Hazrat Umar, Caliphate, they were searching for people. They were actually going out proactively, searching for people. And even during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was proactive in his trying to find the solutions. In fact, there's a hadith that says the zakat recipient should not have to ask. It is your responsibility to know. Right? So it is our responsibility to know who are in need. And that means we have to create the systems in place to gather that, similar to what you guys are doing. The second piece of it is there's nothing in the scholarship that says that when we help people out, we should let them know that this is zakat. So at least that's from my reading. So I think from our perspective, we should be proactive. We should go out, give, and then we should rely on it. Zakat Chicago is an example. If you get a chance, Google Zakat Chicago. It's a committee of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. They're doing some really incredible, I think, work, mashallah, in which they give out grants. So they give grants to agencies that work in Chicago around these 8 categories. And they tell them, here's the money, now go use it. And now tell us at the end of the year how many people you served. They don't say, tell us how this dollar went to this person. Just tell us, as a result of this money, 50,000, 100,000, how many people you served, what was their impact, and how did they become better? And their grant application is really, their grant application and the report application are really good ones to look at as a way to do it. But I think in your case, sort of, to your point, one, I think you're doing the right thing by being proactive. And two, you don't have to tell people that you're giving them zakat money. Great question.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Siddiqui, and thank you everyone for asking your questions. We're right at 4:29, so I think we have to close out, as much as we'd love to hear more answers and questions. But I just want to thank Dr. Siddiqui again, because this conversation has been so interesting. And I think, we can just tell from the interaction, all the questions that people are asking, it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. I know myself, my background's in international development. And after all those years of receiving an education in international development, I'm like, wow, I wish I sat in this workshop like 5 years ago before I even started studying poverty, because subhanAllah, it's all in the Quran, it's all in the Islamic tradition. And we have such a comprehensive, approach that was given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just by addressing those 8 categories. And it's really interesting also to see, the research that shows, yeah, there's this debate and there's this position, there's that position, but this is actually what's happening. And this is actually how Muslims are spending their money. So thank you for that. And I know that a lot of people are interested to look more in depth at a lot of those studies. So inshallah, after the workshop, I'll go ahead and send out an email and include some of those links that you talked about. So thank you again so much. And again, I'll just say thank you to Islamic Relief for supporting this work, specifically the Her Leadership Toolbox series, and all of our gender equity work at the Muslim Women's Organization. I'm going to make a few announcements, and then I'll turn it over to Saraf in case if you have anything that you want to say before we close out. And then we'll read Surah Al-Asr, and we have a survey if everyone can fill it out just to let us know how we did today. And so we can better serve you guys for future workshops, inshallah. So our next workshop is not confirmed yet, but we are looking to do a series in August. So just be on the lookout to receive more information about that once those details are confirmed. There is a form for those of you who are not a part of the Women's Action Network, and if anyone on here would like to join. If you're a leader in the Central Florida area and you want to benefit from more workshops like this one, I'll go ahead and drop that link again in the chat. And then I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to Sadaf.
Assalamualaikum. So, sorry. I wanted to just end with gratitude to Sharif. I always talk to you as Dr. Siddiqui because you're my teacher. But I think the work that you're doing is so very important because we are a new community for our society, and I think it's so important to have a scholarship on these issues. They really help guide us in our work. And I also wanted to say to everybody that's here that, a few of us, Nabil and I included, have talked a lot about what can a Zakat Chicago style initiative for our community look like? Because every community needs a group of people that are dedicated to using philanthropy to make a long-term difference. And that these are conversations that I've been having personally, and I know Nabil has been thinking about. So if you are interested in supporting that kind of work, please do reach out to me. I think everybody has my email address. If you don't, I'm going to just put it in the chat, but please always reach out and share your ideas and let us know how we can work together to make a difference. It does not have to be an MWO project or anybody specifically kind of tied to it. It could be a community-wide effort and a collaborative initiative, because some of these problems are so huge and we can't solve them without really pooling all of our resources to do so. So if you are interested, please do reach out to me. I'm putting my email in here. And I know, Khadija, you asked for Dr. Siddiqui's contact information. I don't know, Dr. Siddiqui, if you're going to be sharing the slides or if you're open to giving your an email address for people to reach out. If not, you all can email me and I can pass that information along or get some responses from Dr. Siddiqui, inshallah. So thank you all. That's all from me.
All right, thank you, Sadaf. And a big thank you to Sadaf, because this was her idea. And I think it was very beneficial. So thank you, Sadaf, for bringing, I know you told me not to call you Dr. Siddiqui, you told me to call you Sharik, but thank you for bringing our guest speaker today, alhamdulillah. And so we'll just go ahead and close out with Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal-Asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu as-salihati wa tawasaw bil-haqqi wa tawasaw bis-sabr. By the passage of time, surely humanity is in grave loss, except for those who have faith, do good, urge each other to the truth, and urge each other to perseverance. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Assalamu alaikum.